Welcome, everybody. August 1st, 2022. Downtown Madison Kiwanis Club will start with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
to
to the United States of America,
States of America,
one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We have our speaker on Zoom, and Jim Patch will do the introduction. Just kind of hold that.
Okay. It's me again. So Gavin Schmitt is our speaker today. He graduated from Green Bay UW, and since then he's been writing books. He's written so far 10 books, 9 on Wisconsin history. He's also a contributor to a few more. And he also is a host, the host of the Milwaukee Mafia podcast. I have not listened to that, I'm afraid. Gavin has been interviewed in newspapers, magazines, and documentaries. He was a consultant on AMC's Making of the Mob, Chicago, and he's assisted in the research of various crime books throughout the country. When not digging through dusty archives and FBI files, he spends most of his day drinking too much coffee, watching films, and being a local historian. And I noticed that he had a book about films. I think it was films and mafia. So since I'm up here and I get to, as they say, keep the podium for a while, I'm going to tell you a quick story. My mother was born in Pisa. She was a war bride, and that's northern Italy, for those of you who don't know. They moved to Madison because my dad was a university faculty member. Anyway, she heard about the Bush. She didn't want to go to the Bush because those people were Sicilian and possibly Southern Italians. And if you know anything about Italy, you know that Northern Italians don't think too highly of Sicilians and Southern Italians. And she was just like that. So then what happens is she really wanted some ricotta cheese. And in the 60s and late 50s, it was not homogenized, and so it was illegal in Wisconsin. She had a friend in the Italian department, Mrs. Galpin, Professor Galpin, and Professor Galpin happened to know the proprietors of Aiello's grocery store on Regent Street, right in the Bush, and Aiello's was taken over by Fraboni's. Anyway, Professor Galpin introduced, quote unquote, to Aiello's. And from then on, my mother got her ricotta. Smuggled in from Illinois. So let me give you Gavin Schmitt. Please give him a big welcome.
Right. Can somebody let me know you can hear me okay?
You're good.
Okay, thank you. All right, so thank you first of all for having me. It's an honor to be here. I know Kiwanis in downtown Madison has been around for over 100 years doing good work. So thank you for all you do. And yeah, I might be a little rusty today. I haven't done a lot of presentations in the last 2 years for reasons I'm sure you can figure out. So thank you for having me. I have no prepared notes, so it's just going to be on the fly here. I had previously done a book on the Milwaukee Mafia, or organized crime in Milwaukee, and as part of doing that, you accumulate a series of notes and files and photos and what have you on other things. So quite a bit on Kenosha and some on Madison, and as I operate, what happens is I keep accumulating things until it reaches the point where I have to do something with those things. And that tends to turn into a book sooner or later. It's become an ongoing problem where I have to keep writing books. So eventually I got enough on Madison where I thought I'd start and write a book on Madison. And there hadn't been really one on the Prohibition era. The only other one that's really out there is a book called Crime of Magnitude, which I recommend. It's a good book, but it wasn't specific to what I was trying to do. And so I went through, obviously, newspapers being a primary source, but then also the archives at the State Historical Society, which were very, very helpful. Their archives on the Greenbush neighborhood are very good. There was a thing called the Neighborhood House there that was trying to Americanize the Sicilian population, which is probably controversial in retrospect, but because of it, they kept really good records on the neighborhood. And they also have really good records on the Ku Klux Klan, which I didn't realize going into the story how big of a part that was going to be, because I don't picture Madison and the Ku Klux Klan being, very compatible, but apparently in the 1920s, it was a very different city than the way we picture it today. So actually there was a significant presence, and Prohibition sort of exacerbated that because the KKK was, first of all, they were in favor of Prohibition, but second of all, they were anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant. And the people who were in the Greenbush neighborhood were Catholic immigrants, or some of them were Jewish, which the KKK didn't like all that much better. So on top of the fact you've already got essentially gang wars going on in this neighborhood for who gets to be like the biggest beer distributor in the Madison area, you've got the KKK coming in and doing the things. I mean, there were no lynchings, but they came in and they did the burning of the cross and all that sort of thing. So things that you do not normally associate with Madison or even Wisconsin in general were surprisingly commonplace in the 1920s in Madison. So found out some very interesting things along the way. I don't know. Do I have like a moderator who helps me along as I go, or do I just ramble until somebody cuts me off here?
I will moderate, and I'll refer questions to you because I know we don't have the great mic system here. So just go on. You've got roughly 20 minutes, and hopefully a lot of Q&As will arise. So just go ahead.
Thank you. Because I can only see the podium. I can't see the crowd, so I don't know. Yeah.
We'll get the crowd for you.
All right. Thank you. Oh, there you are. Hello, everybody. Okay. So, yeah, a number of things came out of this. Crime blossomed. And one of the really interesting things about Madison during Prohibition was just how night and day it was with Milwaukee during Prohibition. Milwaukee, obviously, no secret, long tradition of breweries, a heavy German influence there. And when Prohibition came down, Milwaukee more or less ignored it. It was not that it wasn't enforced, because if the federal agents came in, they would still arrest people, but it was kind of a joke in Milwaukee because the culture there was so connected to drinking that they weren't just going to stop that, and the police weren't going to enforce it because the police grew up in that same culture. Madison was the exact opposite. Madison in the 1920s had a relatively low German, low Catholic background, a very Protestant and what I call Yankee background, and they had the progressives. And the progressives, for all the good they did, and generally speaking, I like the progressive story of Bob LaFollette and all that, but they were very anti-vice, and they saw alcohol as a vice. So they cracked down very hard in Madison on alcohol. But as we now know in retrospect, Prohibition has some serious flaws. Making it illegal doesn't make it go away. So when you've got the Greenbush neighborhood, which I assume everybody here knows what that is, but if you don't, it's kind of like off the Regent Street area. Much of it's not there today. It was torn down to put the hospital there, but it's in the Regent Street area roughly. but it's not very far from the UW campus. It's within walking distance of the campus. And whoa. And I'm going to tell you, I don't think anyone here will be surprised. College students in the 1920s aren't all that different than college students today. They still wanted to drink, if maybe not every night, at least on the weekends. So, they needed somebody to supply that for them. And that's where the Greenbush neighborhood came in, because they had, the Greenbush neighborhood being largely Sicilian, sort of had that background of making their own alcohol, largely wine, but they were able to branch out into beer as well. And so they found themselves a natural market. Out of this arises a number of problems, and I'm glossing over this very fast. This is a lot of material to cover in 20 minutes. But out of this, what happens is a culture of corruption, which shouldn't surprise anybody that this would happen, but it was actually really bad. In Madison and Dane County in the 1920s, the criminal court had two judges. One was Judge Stolen and one was Judge Hopman. And when they were in public, they were very in line with the progressive ideals. They were very outspoken against alcohol or what they saw as vice, like women going out alone at night, things like that. And so on the face of it, they seemed like they would be very good at cracking down. But a strange thing happened behind the scenes where Judge Stolen found himself getting into some trouble. And we're not entirely sure what it was. The speculation was always that there was a woman involved, but nobody knows for sure. But he ended up making payments to somebody, and he's making these payments over and over and over again to the point where he's not being able to pay his own mortgage. So his mortgage payments keep going up, the interest keeps going up, and he never gets to pay off his house. And to fund this, what he does is he goes to the Greenbush neighborhood and he goes to men that he had previously had in court that he knew were making hundreds of dollars off of bootlegging. And he says, I need a loan. And he would borrow $500 at a time, which is significant money in those days. And he was not very good about paying them back. He would say, oh, I'll pay you back, give me a month or two. But then a month or two would come by, he wouldn't pay them back. He'd actually borrow more money. This is a problem. This is a problem because now when these guys get arrested, there's a 50-50 chance here. If they go to Judge Hopman's court, they're probably going to get prosecuted. They're probably going to go to jail or prison or whatever, the punishment may be. If they go in Judge Stolen's court, they're still going to get something. I mean, he has to make it look good, so they'll get a fine or something. But their punishments will be significantly less because they've got this, they're not maybe purposely blackmailing him, but he's got this knowledge that at any time they can come forward and say what's going on, and his entire career will be ruined. And long story short, his career ultimately is ruined, which is how we know about it. He was caught and he was forced out, but it really caused havoc in the Madison area for trying to actually clean up the Greenbush area when, half of the judges, being only two, but half of the judges weren't going to seriously do anything about it. So it was a real problem. The other major corruption that was determined was the KKK again. The local newspaper editor, and I always pronounce his name wrong, so if somebody wants to jump in and say his name, tell me so I don't do it wrong. But Bill Eviu, is that how you say it?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, so he was very opposed to the KKK. That was one of his main things that he rallied against. And he went out of his way to collect information on them. His paperwork in the State Historical Society has got files upon files of things he collected throughout the state. And he somehow managed to get membership rolls to a number of the different chapters throughout the state. The chapters were called conclaves. And maybe this will shock you, maybe not, but it turned out there was a significant overlap between people who were members of the KKK and people who were in the Madison Police Department. So when it came time to actually do something about these guys coming in, making threats, burning crosses, that sort of thing, it became hard to get them out of the Greenbush neighborhood when the people assigned to get them out were some of the same people coming back at night and doing the things they weren't supposed to do. Of course, when that gets published, that's a scandal of its own. But for a while there, it made law enforcement very challenging because they clearly had one side on that. They were against the bootleggers, but they weren't necessarily against the people terrorizing the bootleggers. So just a nasty storm in the Greenbush area where you got two gangs against each other competing for bootleg profits. You got an outside group coming in, terrorizing them. And some terrible things came out of this. Obviously, violence is one. There was a very high murder rate in the 1920s, specifically in that neighborhood. People getting their houses blown up, people getting shot, and not always, not that it's okay to shoot anybody, but it's not always bootleggers shooting bootleggers. Sometimes kids would get shot on accident. It was pretty terrible. And in one instance, there was a Jewish man who was constantly being harassed, both by the police and by the KKK, possibly, again, it may turn out they were the same people, but constantly being harassed. And one day he couldn't take it anymore. And when they busted in, he started firing and he ended up killing a police officer. And that's a serious, serious no-no. You can't do that. But he ends up going to prison for quite a while and then ends up actually getting committed because he goes crazy while in prison. His name was Rudy Jesner. And just strange things came out of this. In fact, I'll segue from there and say this was an absolutely terrifying time to be a police officer because the Madison Police Department existed through most of the state's history. And now the state's been around for a little over 170 years. And I will tell you that 4 officers died on the Madison Police Department in the 1920s in the line of duty. 0 died prior to that, and 0 have died since, unless it happened in the last couple of years. But when the book came out, nobody had. So that 10-year span was worse than the other 160 years combined for law enforcement being the target of violence. So just an absolutely terrible time in Madison history that is largely glossed over, I think. Wow. My clock says I'm at the 20-minute mark, so if anybody has questions, feel free to jump in.
I do. What about the influence on the legislature, like a mile from Greenbush? Did the organized crime try to influence the politicians?
It doesn't seem to be the case. Normally, I think that's something they would do, but because the Madison politicians were largely in the progressive movement, I don't think they were as corruptible, at least not corruptible by those forces. The district attorney in Dane County in the 1920s was Phil LaFollette, and Phil LaFollette, is a member of the LaFollette family, and he goes on to be governor in his own right. So yeah, he was an influential politician both on the city and the state level, and he was more or less untouchable. If he was corrupted, nobody ever noticed. Like they never found out. So I will give Madison credit for that. That there, as many problems as they may have had, the statewide corruption, and I'm not saying there wasn't statewide corruption because it's politics. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised in the least, but not from these groups. Sure, go back.
Any connection with the Chicago mob?
Connection to the Chicago mob.
Connection to the Chicago mob, sure. So there was, it was somewhat loose, but there was. So there was a man named Tony Musso, who was a major bootlegger in Madison, big time, maybe the biggest. And he definitely had links with the outfit or the mafia in Chicago. And we know this because he was working with them to basically get fake alcohol, fake booze. What he would do is he would work with them through, they would counterfeit labels in Chicago, and he would go down there and he would pick them up. And what you would do is you would get these labels, and you could do one or two things with them. One, you either put a label of a really good brand of booze on a bottle of not very good booze, so you can charge more for it. Or a lot of what Musso did was he had these tax labels printed up, and they were backdated. So they were pre-Prohibition, which technically made them legal, because if you had alcohol in your possession prior to Prohibition, you didn't have to dump it out at midnight. You got to keep it. So if he could fake that his collection of alcohol was predated, he could sell that on. So there's not like a strong, they were much closer to both Milwaukee, and there was like a significant crime group in Rockford, Illinois, but there was some overlap with Chicago, definitely.
Ed.
Two-part question. The Wonder Bar, located by the Coliseum, reportedly has had a lot of activity during this era, and maybe you can comment or confirm or deny this. Secondly, there's a house on Monona Way that had a tunnel between the boathouse and the house, and reportedly a truck from the Chicago area would unload its cargo into a boat, which was taken to the north side of the city on its way to Minneapolis. And this was a way of avoiding the tax or the feds.
Mm-hmm.
Did you catch those?
Yes, yeah, I heard that. Okay. As for the second one, I can't speak to that story specifically. It's certainly possible, and there definitely was alcohol running across state lines, and there were tunnels and things like that. So it's certainly possible. I don't know that story in detail specifically, but that is true that it did happen. And a lot of times alcohol would come in from Canada. So it would be brought in across the Great Lakes. And a lot of it did end up in both Detroit and Chicago because they had the ports there. And Canada had this weird thing going on where they had prohibition simultaneously as the United States. There was prohibition also in Canada, but their laws had some loopholes. And one of them was the distilleries were still allowed to make alcohol as long as it was exported. They couldn't sell it to other Canadians, but they could export it. So there was like a Seagram's factory. There were a couple of different factories, but Seagram's is a notable name. There was a Seagram's factory, and and people of questionable character would bring their boat up to it in the Canada border, and it was perfectly legal for Seagram's to sell it to them. It was probably not legal for them to buy it and transport it, but on the Seagram's end, it was legal. So you could still get the real thing. And that did come down to the major ports. So it's not uncommon for something to go from Detroit or Chicago and be transported across Wisconsin to Minnesota or beyond. If somebody really wanted an authentic thing, which was significantly pricier than the stuff you could make in your bathtub, but if you could afford it, some people wanted it. That's the only thing I can really say to that, because I don't know the specifics of the Monona story. The Wonder Bar, I am not an expert on the Wonder Bar. I'm aware of its history and rumors that it was allegedly owned by Roger Toohey. And Roger Toohey was a gangster in the 20s who was a rival to Al Capone. And he ended up getting very notable in his day because he was kidnapped by a man named Jake Factor. And Jake Factor was the brother of Max Factor, the head of the cosmetics company. So Max Factor being an actual person's name, not just a company name. So Roger Toohey was sort of famous in his own right. But the thing of it is I don't know that anyone's ever been able to confirm it. There's the stories that he owned it. There's stories that there were like little holes on the second floor so guns could be stuck out and fired from and things like that. But I've never seen any record of his actual ownership. I've never seen a newspaper story where anything ever actually happened at that building, where there was ever a gunfight, anything of the sort. Which doesn't mean it didn't happen, and it doesn't mean he didn't own it, because he could have had it in somebody else's name. But when I'm approaching things as history, I have to have a solid record. And if I don't have Roger Toohey's name on a deed, if I don't have a newspaper article saying that the police were called to the Wonder Bar or whatever it may have been called in those days, I can't say it. And again, not to say that it didn't happen, but it's my job not to pass on stories that I can't document. So it's my personal opinion that the Wonder Bar has grown in reputation and legend over the years. And I think most of what people have heard about it is probably not accurate, but I don't know that 100%. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but that's about the best I can give you.
Yes, what happened to all these bootleggers when Prohibition ended in Madison?
I didn't hear that one.
What happened to the bootleggers when Prohibition ended?
Oh, okay. It varied. So some of them became completely regular, normal citizens. And they invested their money into grocery stores, into taverns, into things like that. It was very common for somebody who was a known bootlegger to go into the tavern business for obvious reasons. They've already got the experience and the built-in clientele. There were other guys who were actually more interested in the criminal end of things, and a number of them fled and went down to Rockford, and where the gang activity continued. And Tony Musa, who I had mentioned earlier, was one of those guys. He went down there and continued on for many years, was a pretty terrible person. Some of them got deported because a number of these guys were immigrants. So if they were breaking federal laws, they could be deported. So a number of them didn't even make it through the Prohibition years. Yeah, and that's about it, I guess, as far as things go. Madison is sort of unique, in my opinion, as for the organized crime, in that it peaked in Prohibition and then just kind of dropped off. There were still guys around forever. Now, if you've heard of anybody in Madison, the guy you would have heard of was Carlo Caputo. And Carlo was rumored to be a mafia guy his entire life. I mean, that followed him everywhere. Sometimes the papers would even print it, which I'm surprised they could get away with. But, you know, after the Prohibition years, he basically took whatever money he made and he invested it in real estate. And as far as I know, everything was legitimate after that. From the FBI's point of view, it was kind of funny because they received a list of the alleged known members in Madison, which by the time the FBI was looking into things was years later, like decades later, and it was 5 or 6 guys. And they went around and they took pictures of these guys, but they're already, 60 years old at this point. So they're catching a lot of these guys like planting gardens and sitting in their front yard, like not doing anything illegal. These are all retired guys by this point. So it's weird. Whereas for most other places like Chicago, Milwaukee, and elsewhere, Prohibition was kind of the kickoff, But in Madison, once it ended, it seems like it just disappeared.
Ken,
I grew up in Kenosha. So you got a story about Kenosha?
story about Kenosha.
I can't do it in the time allotted. Oh, I've hit the thing again. Okay. I'm in a room on a timer. Yeah, Kenosha is really a world of its own. I mean, there were gangs there going back to the 1910s that were shooting at each other. Like they had their territory mapped out down to the corner, to the point where they would stand kitty corner to each other and shoot across the street. And it continued on at least through the 60s, 70s, 80s. Some people still say today, there were rumors during like Jim Doyle's time in governor that there were still guys in Kenosha that were trying to work their way into the dog track gambling. So yeah, Kenosha I can't do in a very brief time because it's its own entire story. There's a lot of stuff that's happened in Kenosha over the years.
I want to thank you very much.
Sure.
Other questions? Jim?
Does the name DeSalvo ring any bells?
Sure.
DeSalvo.
Yes. So the DeSalvo family in Madison had some mob connections. There was Benny DeSalvo or Benedetto DeSalvo, and there was Cosmo DeSalvo, father and son. And they were always rumored to be mob guys. And again, same thing, after the Prohibition years, you can't really pinpoint them doing a whole lot of things. But because you mentioned it, I'll mention that a member of the family in the couple of years published a book called Sicilian.
Tell him it's.
You don't hear. You're locked up. Keep trying. Our connection is unstable here.
Did it get bad there?
There we go.
Okay, all I'm saying is there's a book called Sicilian Loves. If you can seek it out, it is a firsthand account or sometimes secondhand, I guess, but it's a family account of the DeSalvo family in Madison. So I don't want to speak too much about that just because it can be told better by the family themselves. So that is out there. And I was in communication with him while he was writing it, and we kind of compared notes. And then I do have a copy of the book, of course. It's a great book. And it's also got some recipes in it if you're interested in that sort of thing. So
I'll take the last question. What about other vices? Was it only booze that were the big vices? What about gambling? Some of the other vices that humans endeavor in?
during the Prohibition era, it was overwhelmingly booze. Now, later on, that spread out, and there was a later generation who, it's hard to tell if it was a continuation of the same gangs or if it sprung up on its own. There's some family connections there, but it's very loose. But most notable guy later on was a man named Sam Sarrow. And I mean, this is years later. And he had a string of, I don't know what the polite word for, well, he called them massage parlors on like East Washington Avenue. And, you know, out of there, he would move stolen goods, and he would sell drugs, and he would do every other possible thing you can possibly imagine that is considered a vice, gambling included with that. But that's much later. I see like very little of that in the early years, which is suspicious because that's in contrast to Milwaukee and Kenosha, where there were a number of brothels and bookie joints and things like that. I mean, I don't doubt they were in Madison. I would be shocked if they weren't, because that's just, it's everywhere. You can't really get rid of it completely, but it just didn't make the papers. And so I don't see a lot of that. That's unfortunately the limitations of what I have to do. If it didn't make the papers and it's not in a police or FBI file, I don't know a lot about it because I'm very dependent on that. But yeah, it was, seems like it was primarily alcohol in Madison during that time.
Well, I want to thank you, Gavin, for a very informative talk, and maybe we'll have you come back and talk about Kenosha or something.
Sure.
Thank
I'd
you
be
very
happy
much.
to do it. Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much. This has been fun.
We'll share your book titles too with everybody
Oh, I
who
appreciate
wants to
that.
further it. So Jim, you can follow up on that. Okay, we have announcements. First one, Dick reminded me that I forgot to put in the email. A week from Wednesday is our second picnic of the summer out at Lake Farms Park. So Dick, do you want to explain more?
Yeah, we're not going to plan a cookout where we prepare the meals there, but we had a really good time with what, a dozen people I think came last time. And it just wasn't, everybody brought something of their own that they prefer to eat, because it's hard with the smaller numbers to determine just what food we should buy and grill and everything. But it was really a nice time. It's on Wednesday, same place, shelter number 3. And I will, in a few days here, I'll send out an email to everybody, map attached, if you haven't been there before. But do bring something, some food or nothing, and just enjoy the conversation. So it should be another pleasant evening. It's a shelter, so if there's rain, it doesn't make any difference. Plenty of room.
I'm looking for my email today. There we go. There was a really good article in yesterday's State Journal on Miracle League and the impact we're having on individual kids. It's amazing. Tom and Abe and I and Richard, it's just a fun night. So this is the last week of games. You may not want to come Wednesday when it's supposed to be back to the brutal weather, but this week, all the teams who are playing will get their medal, and it's just a fun event. Let's see, Cops and Kids. Tom is going this afternoon to the next Cops and Kids event at Boys and Girls Club. Anything there, Tom?
No, it's, they're working with the Madison Police Department's Community Relations Division, which is 3 officers. And 2 of the 3 will be there because the 3rd one's husband came down with COVID this morning, so she won't be there. But they just read and chat. And we did used to do it at the community centers around town. And I'm not exactly sure why we're not doing it anymore, but there were questions about having policemen with guns at the community centers. But they will be with guns at their Boys and Girls Clubs. And I think that's the real world for kids in there.
Yeah.
Where's the Boys and Girls Club?
It's a 2001 Tatum or Taylor, just South Park Street, a block off to the east.
Behind the Walgreens, kind of there, to the east of the Walgreens.
Taylor Mars.
Taft?
Starts with an AT everywhere.
Isn't it Taft Street?
It could be Taft.
It's been a while since I've been down there, but Yep. So that is today. We'll get to moment of reflection in a second. Just future speakers next week. It's talking about democracy in Wisconsin. If you read the agendas, I glommed onto the August 15th open date that Jim hadn't found a speaker yet, so I told him to stop. We'll have a club discussion primarily about budgets, so it's a truly transparent discussion, as well as we may get into some other issues obvious to the club with leadership. So it may be a short meeting, or we could talk a lot. It's all up to you guys. So The 22nd, history of paper money in the US. That sounds interesting. Thank you, Jim. And then meeting at Oakwood Village is still on as far as we know. Tom, there's bingo out there this Thursday. So if they change their rules, we'll be back here on the 29th. But right now we're out there. Then it's Labor Day. And then we got a couple more in September that are in the email today. So thank you, Jim, again, for all you do for the programs. On the 15th, in 2 weeks, we are having the board meeting after our regular meeting. So that's why I kind of wanted to broach the subject, because the board needs to vote on the budgets. And the more input we have from members about the budgets and the committee budgets, et cetera, the more the board can make some meaningful decisions if we need to. Let's see. That's all I have. Other announcements. Ken.
Question on how Eileen is doing? How's Eileen doing?
Eileen was exposed to COVID. Is that what I remember this morning? She had some surgery on her nose area, sinuses and things. It took her a few weeks recuperating there, but then I think she was exposed. So she's in isolation. There's a lot of it going around, and thankfully all of mine is allergies. It's also hay fever season. So
That's what the lieutenant governor said last fall, too.
and apparently there's rebound COVID too, as the president experienced. How are you doing, Mike? You're okay? Okay. So watch yourself out there. That's why we're wearing masks to a large degree. Other announcements? Any announcements? Going once? We're going to get out way early. I get a lot of free time here for future meetings to run over.
Reflection.
Reflection is it. That's it. Co has some humor, I believe, is what she said, because obviously Eileen could not make it.
Do I have to do anything?
I just held it.
Okay. Okay, yes, just a bit of silliness this morning. There we go. Okay. A group of seniors were sitting around talking all about their ailments while drinking coffee. My arms have gotten so weak I can hardly lift this cup of coffee, said one. Yes, I know, said another. My cataracts are so bad I can't even see my coffee. I couldn't even mark an X at election time. My hands are so crippled, volunteered a third. What? Speak up, I can't hear you, shouted another. I can't turn my head because of arthritis in my neck, said a fifth senior, to which several others nodded weakly in agreement. My blood pressure pills make me so dizzy, exclaimed another. I forget where I am and where I'm going, said another. Well, I guess that's the price we pay for getting old, winced an old man as he slowly shook his head. The others nodded in agreement. Well, count your blessings, said a woman. Thank goodness we can all still drive.
On that note, thank you all for coming.